Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of David McCain, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECN. Programs like this one would not be possible without your support. We thank those of you who are members and ask those who are not to consider taking out a membership by visiting the library's website. Let us begin tonight's special forum by asking all of the veterans in our audience to stand so that we can thank you for your service to our country. In a recent New York Times column, our moderator Bob Herbert writes, "The idea that the United States is at war and hardly any of its citizens are paying attention to the terrible burden being shouldered by its men and women in uniform is beyond appalling. We can get fired up about Lady Gaga, fantasy football, and obsessively narcissistic tweets, but American soldiers fighting and dying in foreign land, that is such a yawn." No one has ever accused our guest speaker, Sebastian Junger, of writing books that would cause his readers to yawn. Attracted since childhood to extreme situations and people at the edges of things, he writes often about ordinary people in dangerous situations, from his harrowing account of the Boston Strangler, who happened to work as a handyman in the Junger's home in Belmont, to his white-knuckle chronicle of the crew of the Andrea Gale and his bestseller, The Perfect Storm. And now he has set his focus, using what one reviewer calls a laser, not a floodlight, on how modern warfare is experienced by those who do the fighting. Over the course of 15 months, Mr. Junger and photojournalist Tim Hetherington were embedded with Battle Company of the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team in the Korengal Valley in eastern Afghanistan, a remote outpost that saw more combat with the Taliban than any other region of that war-torn country, and was deemed at the time the most dangerous place on earth. The result is his newest book, War, a story about war that is much more than a war story. What elevates war out of its particular time and place, writes one reviewer, are the author's meditation on the minds and emotions of the soldiers with whom he has shared hardships, dangers, and spells of boredom so intense that everyone sits around wishing to hell something would happen and wishes to God it was over when it inevitably does. The book is on sale in our store, and Mr. Junger will sign copies at the conclusion of our forum. We will also see this evening a sneak preview of war's documentary counterpart, Restrepo, described by the New York Times as an impressive, even heroic feat of journalism. It won the 2010 Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival and will air nationally on the National Geographic Channel on November 29th at 9 p.m. On a personal note, I mentioned to Mr. Junger that as a measure of his appeal, my high school-aged son devoured the book and loved the film, and that this is the only forum in my 12-year history here at the library that he asked to attend. Though I should note I required him to attend an event in 2006 when Senator Barack Obama spoke here, sensing it might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him to be in the presence of a future president. The moderator that day happened to also be Bob Herbert. So my son will now have the misimpression, Bob, that you are as much a permanent fixture on this stage as I am. If you are like me, you often learn more about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from Bob Herbert's columns than through the direct reporting from his colleagues overseas. A veteran himself, drafted during the Vietnam War and serving in Korea, he decided to be a journalist after returning from his experience in the military. He has won numerous awards for his reporting and commentary, including the Reidenhauer Courage Prize for his fearless articulation of unpopular truths. And we learned earlier this evening that he is the hero of Sebastian Junger's mother, who is here in the front row as well. There are many reasons to have this forum here today on Veterans Day, not the least of which being that this institution honors the memory of a World War II veteran turned president. But less well known is the fact that we also house the papers of Ernest Hemingway, whose experience of war as a young man informed many of his most famous novels and short stories. At the Hemingway Centennial held here in 1999, Tobias Wolff suggested that Hemingway's great war work deals with aftermath, with what happens to the soul in war and how people deal with that afterward. The problem that Hemingway set for himself in stories like Soldier's Home, Wolff concluded, is the difficulty of telling the truth about what one has been through. He knew about his own difficulty in doing that. Few have written as famously as Hemingway about the life of a writer, the importance, in his words, of writing one true sentence, and how the written word can serve as a mirror for society to see itself in a new light. In Sebastian Junger, we have with us this evening one of the great writers of our time, an artist of Hemingway's proportions. One reviewer writes that Mr. Junger's book on war refracts our vision. We see in it the good in us and regret that we are not better. Or as Dexter Filkins has written, in this new book, Junger is aiming for more than just a boots-on-the-ground narrative of the travails of fighting. War strives to offer not only a picture of American fighting men, but a discourse on the nature of war itself. This is no small ambition. He writes some beautiful sentences about this ugly world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming back to the Kennedy Library Sebastian Junger and Bob Herbert.
It's a great honor for me to be asked to participate in this program. This is an issue that is so close to my heart, has been for so long. And I can tell you right off that War is just a terrific book, and Restrepo is an equally terrific film. So we'll get started. I have a lot of questions, and there's going to be a period for you guys to ask some questions, so let's go. And Sebastian, you can orient us by describing this project and just how it got started.
Sure. I've been going to Afghanistan since 1996, 96, 2000, 2001, when the Northern Alliance took Kabul. It looked like a very easy war in 2001. The Afghans were, at least the ones I talked to, were incredibly grateful to the United States to be rid of the Taliban. They hated the Taliban. The Taliban crumbled in a couple of weeks. And I mean, this is my opinion here, but I think it was such an easy victory that the focus of the United States, particularly the Bush administration, just wandered and refocused on Iraq. And while we were focused on Iraq, Afghanistan just fell apart. 19,000 American soldiers was not enough to keep it glued together. There's 40,000 cops in New York City. It wasn't going to work. And by 2005, I realized, wow, the military of my country is going to be in Afghanistan, this country that I've kind of fallen in love with, probably for a very long time. And if it doesn't work, the Afghan people are going to go through another convulsion of violence and chaos and nihilism, just like the 90s. And so I decided to embed with a unit of U.S. military. I was with Battle Company of the 173rd. And I grew up in the wake of Vietnam. The military had a very complicated, frankly, troubled reputation then. And I didn't know what to expect. And I was just overwhelmed by these guys that I was with, at how professional, how great they were. I just loved them. And I thought, if Battle Company of the 173rd goes back to Afghanistan, I want to follow one platoon for a whole deployment. They were supposed to go to Iraq, and at the last moment they changed. They went to Afghanistan, they went to the Korangal Valley, and I had my chance. I wanted to write a book and make a movie. I'd been shooting a little bit of video. That was the plan. I was going to go over there as much as I could afford to in my personal life back home. I wound up doing 5 one-month trips to the Korangal Valley, most of it spent at this small outpost called Restrepo.
First, tell us roughly how many men there are in a platoon, and also give us an idea of who they were, just basically the range of ages and their backgrounds.
A platoon is about 30, 35 men. the Korengal was 6 miles long. Battle company basically had 4 platoons, about 150 men, American soldiers in the Korengal. The age range, God, the youngest guy was 18. He came in January. He was a replacement, and he was 18. He seemed 14. He turned into a very good soldier, but that took a couple of months. The oldest guy was 42. He was a pretty successful guy. He was bored back home. He owned a small business. I think he sold it. He got out. I think he was divorced. I can't remember his details, but he was bored, and he decided he wanted to join the Army. And so he joined at 40. And 18 months later, he's on a hilltop getting shot at. And I was 45 at the time, so I was the oldest person at Restrepo. The soldiers, what 18, 20-year-olds are like. Anything over 30 is, they don't even realize why you're bothering to continue, So I was trying to explain to them that it actually was worthwhile after 30. Like, there was something on the other side for you.
We have a clip from the film, and then I'll have a couple of questions about the film itself. So if we could show that clip.
I've been on about 4 or 5 different types of sleeping pills, and none of them help. That's how bad the nightmares are. I prefer not to sleep and not dream about it than sleep and just see the picture in my head.
Hey, Roger, the tech button,
Everybody's like, oh, you're going to the Korengal? Oh, and they feel sorry for you. Deadliest place on earth, the Korengal Valley.
We're not ready for this.
I'm thinking, what are we doing?
First friend I lost was Restrepo.
Where Restrepo died, we shot off flares.
In the middle of the night, we put up a fire base. They realized once they could not knock off OP Restrepo, we had the upper hand.
The film is chilling, so if you have an opportunity to see it, I'd really urge you to do that. Is my audio, can you hear me?
They had an audio problem with the film. I think they're going to film again.
Okay.
I've been on about 4 or 5 different types of sleeping pills, and none of them help. That's how bad the nightmares are. I prefer not to sleep and not dream about it than sleep and just see the picture in my head.
Hey, Roger, the tech button,
Everybody's like, oh, you're going to the Korengal? Oh, and they feel sorry for you. Deadliest place on earth, the Korengal Valley.
We're not ready for this.
I'm thinking, what are we doing?
First friend I lost was Restrepo.
Where Restrepo died, we shot off flares.
In the middle of the night, we put up a fire base. They realized once they could not knock off OP Restrepo, we had the upper hand.
Hey, babe, I miss you.
It takes a little bit out of you every time you see one of your boys get hurt. It's really like a big family. I want you guys to mourn, and then I want you guys to get over it and do your jobs.
2 months and counting down.
I just don't like the way it is. I don't like how it feels right now.
I kill a bunch of bad guys. In the same instance, I'm killing 5 locals. I need to know better so that I'm not killing these people.
I hit the bottom right of the building.
As soon as I pop my head up, guess who?
Nobody's gonna help you. You're in no man's land.
The fear is always there, especially at night when you can't see what's coming at you.
Are you going to go back to the civilian world?
I have no idea.
I still obviously haven't figured out how to deal with it inside.
The only hope I have right now is that eventually I'll be able to process it differently. I'm never going to forget it. I don't want to not have that as a memory, because that was one of the moments that makes me appreciate everything that I have.
Wow. Now, the film starts with footage of some of the men on their way to Afghanistan, and you were with them then. What were their attitudes like? I mean, were they excited, anxious, fearful?
Actually, the first bit of footage is on a train in Italy. They're based in Italy, in Vicenza, and that's one of the very, very small parts of the movie that we didn't film. That was just stuff that they had filmed. I didn't know those guys yet, and so that was footage we got from them. It was a little one-chip camera. But I can speak to their attitudes. They're in the 173rd Airborne. That's a combat unit, and every guy that I was with, at least in battle company, had to work very, very hard and pass a lot of tests to get into a unit like that. You know, they would say to me, look, if you just need a paycheck, you can change the oil in a Humvee in a rear base pretty easily. You can volunteer for the Army and do that. To get into a combat unit, you actually, it's like making the football team. You actually kind of have to want it. And so those guys, when they were going over there in May '07, the big war was Iraq, and they were going to Afghanistan, and quite a few of them, their main worry was that they were not going to see any combat. That they were going to be
disappointed they're going to Afghanistan rather than...
Absolutely. They were like, we're trained to fight, and
Wow.
It's going to be a really long year if we're just sort of sitting on sandbags watching the clock turn slowly.
Right.
So that was one of their anxieties, that they were going to spend a year over there and not actually come home with any combat experience.
Well, turns out they didn't have to
They did not have to worry about it.
When they did show up in the Korengal Valley, at least some of the men seemed taken aback. I mean, the young fellow we heard in the clip say, you know, what are we doing here? And there was another fellow who said his mind told him as he looked around the landscape that he was going to die there. What was it that was so intimidating about that place?
It was very, very rugged terrain. It was like they dropped those guys in the Colorado Rockies. And their previous deployment, I think probably half the unit had been on the previous deployment in '05, '06 in Zabul province, which is kind of this moonscape. And that was where I had been with them 2 years earlier. So they get dropped into essentially the Colorado Rockies, and these guys are carrying minimum on the shortest patrols, they're carrying 80 pounds. Up to 120. On multi-day patrols, they're carrying 150, 160 pounds. So, you know, when you look at some mountains like the Korengal, it's part of the Hindu Kush mountain range. When you look at those mountains, they look very different if you're just running around in them or you're carrying 150 pounds. It's completely different, and they knew it, and they knew they were going to have to walk around with those kinds of loads while fighting. And they understood how hard it was going to be.
Right. Now, you and the photographer, Tim Hetherington, right? You guys are right with them when you're over there. And you had an experience yourself. I mean, the vehicle you were traveling in was hit with a roadside bomb and IED. So I can tell you this, it was dramatic in the film, and I wasn't there. So tell us about that.
Yeah, we had a lot of experiences that were deeply frightening. You know, the thing about combat is that it's so random. I mean, one of the best soldiers out there, Sergeant Larry Rugel, was killed. And there were guys who, you know, like Vaughn, who showed up age 18, had no idea what he was doing, and he got out of it okay. And they all knew that. And then as a journalist, if you're out there enough, you start to realize it. Like, wow, this is among other things, it's completely random. You know, in a firefight, I had I hate telling the story with my mom here. I haven't done this before, but I'll proceed. Plug your ears. It was a very, very quiet day at Restrepo, and Nothing much was happening, and I was leaning against some sandbags, and some dirt flew into my face. And what you have to understand is that bullets go much faster than the sound of a gunshot. So if someone's shooting at you from a few hundred yards, from a quarter mile, the way you know you're getting shot at first is that you hear this really bizarre and pretty subtle snapping sound, and it's bullets breaking the speed of sound by your head. And then the gunshots come afterwards. So when you get ambushed, the first thing that happens is everyone kind of looks around with a frown on their face, like, are we getting shot at? Like, that's the first thought. And then you hear da-da-da-da, and it's clear. Well, what had happened was a bullet had hit next to me against the sandbag. It was the first round of the first burst of an hour-long firefight, and it sprayed dirt in my face. And I had no idea what it was. I was like, God, what was that? That's random. And once you realize how random it is, you don't really, psychologically, you don't know what to do. Like, do I sit here or here? Like, should I, like, it calls everything, it's like a kind of an existential crisis. It calls everything into question. So with the IED, the footage that you saw there of the bomb going off under the Humvee, that was me. That was some footage that I shot, and it was really pretty traumatic because it's hard to explain, but none of us were hurt. We were fine physically. And for the next few hours, I was just on this weird high, like I could barely sit still. I was so excited, sort of, I don't know, I was just completely amped up. And that night, I just crashed, and I got incredibly depressed. I didn't get scared, I got sad. I got sad about the whole thing. And it's very easy to sort of sit here in this country and say, oh, war is such a sad thing. It's very easy to say that. It is sad. But you kind of know that or at least I know that in an abstract, intellectual way. The experience of war is many things. It's scary, it's exciting, it's profound, it's disturbing, whatever. It's every human emotion. That's what war is. But the sadness about it is, it's a subtler thing. And it immediately, when you're over there, that sadness immediately gets sort of trampled by these more robust emotions like fear and excitement. You don't get in touch with the sadness while you're there, except occasionally. And I did that night. And I just had this sort of existential sort of moment of like, my God, there's 150 young men, all of whom I care about tremendously, fighting a couple hundred young men who are on the other side, who I would probably care about if I got, at least some of them, who I got to know them. Like, what are we doing? This is so sad. It was just sort of heartbreaking. That feeling went away immediately as soon as we got attacked again. Disappeared. Was not interested in the sadness. I was interested in not getting hit by a bullet and going home. But for a while, and it gave me terrible, terrible dreams for a while. That was like my first real moment of, it was kind of a moral and, not a moral, it's kind of a spiritual crisis almost as a war reporter. It sort of started that night. It lasted for a little while.
Explain what Restrepo means, why the film is called Restrepo, and the importance of Restrepo to these men.
Juan Sebastian Restrepo, his middle name was Sebastian, was the platoon medic. He was born in Colombia, the country of Colombia, immigrant to this country. I think that's worth noting in this today with all of the conversations about immigration. We should remember that people who have immigrated here are dying for this country. Just throw that in there. Restrepo was the platoon medic, and they were on a routine patrol down to a village called Aliabad, and he was hit in the jaw and throat, and he was bleeding out, and he was the medic, so there was no medic to treat him. He was the medic. So he was in the middle of this firefight. He was, they were ambushed pretty badly, and he was telling the guys around him how to save his life. And they couldn't do it. And he died. And he was just beloved within the platoon. He was just a great guy. And everyone loved him, and he died, and it was just devastating. I think the main trauma of war, at least for the guys I was with, wasn't almost getting killed. it was the loss of their friends. The grief of losing their friends transcended, I think, every other trauma combined out there. So a month later, they decided to build an outpost on this ridge that the enemy was using to shoot down into the company headquarters. If you ever need to fight a war, one thing you need to know is that it's better to shoot from high ground into low ground than the other way around. That's like the basic tactic in war. And a lot of war consists of like carrying really heavy stuff up to the top of the hills and shooting down at your enemy. Like that's basically war. So the battalion commander, the company commander decided to put an outpost on this ridge that the enemy was using to fire into the company headquarters. And so at night, 2nd Platoon and 3rd Platoon walked up this ridge, 2-hour walk from the main base. They walked up this ridge with their pickaxes and shovels and their weapons, and they started hacking away at the rock. There was no sand up there to fill sandbags, so they just hacked away at the rock with these pickaxes and worked furiously all night so that they'd have some protection in the morning because they knew they'd get attacked. The first day, the enemy came at them, attacked them 13 times. There were 13 firefights that day. They worked straight and fought straight for 24 hours.
So they're fighting and digging, building this outpost.
Yeah, it was 100+ degrees. Their body armor, I mean, just working like a chain gang up there. When they got attacked, that was actually a relief because they could lie down, drink some water, shoot back, sort of relatively relaxed compared to what they were doing. And they built this outpost, and it worked. It blocked the enemy from attacking the main base. But just to describe it briefly, it was sandbags, they called them rock bags because that's what they were filled with, rock bags, and ammunition and MREs. That's all they had up there. There was no running water. They couldn't bathe for a month at a time. Because they couldn't bathe, they didn't change their clothes. Because they didn't change their clothes, they didn't get out of their clothes. They just wore their clothes so they fell off. They went on patrol, they'd come back, clothes would dry, they'd lie down, go to sleep, get up in the morning, do it again. A month at a time, they'd go back to the company, they'd walk back to the company base, get a shower. There was no internet, no phone at Restrepo. So once a month, they could call their girlfriends or their wives. They'd get a shower, they'd get a hot meal. There was no hot food up there. And there were, my first or second day at Restrepo, we were attacked 4 times. It got absolutely hammered by the enemy. They were up there for a year.
Wow. Your goal was one of your goals was to bring home to civilians here in the United States the real life of soldiers in combat under these extraordinarily stressful conditions. So if you could sort of, you started doing a little bit of it in talking about the outpost, but if you, a little more about the daily lives of these soldiers, and then we'll talk about what it was like in combat. But what was it like living out there? For them, it was for 14 or 15 months.
Yeah. Okay, so as it got colder, they built these plywood hooches. They were so narrow, so cramped and everyone had a little bunk, and I had a bunk. And from where I slept, I could reach out and touch 3 other men, no problem. That's how cramped they were. It got very, very cold in the Korengal, and sub-zero at night, just unbelievably cold. And so they had these little gasoline heaters, which sort of cooked the people that were next to them, and everyone else froze. And these hooches were, you can imagine how they smelled. It was just the machinery of war. It was guns, it was hand grenades, it was, Playboy magazines, pinned to the walls. It was dirty fatigues, belts of ammo. It was just like this crazy, deadly locker room. And everyone would go to sleep, and you wake up in the morning, and the guys took guard duty, 2-hour shifts. They threatened to make me, but I didn't have to. And so some days nothing happened. You just hung out. And other days, probably every other day, they'd send out a patrol. I did every patrol that I could. the reason that they would send out patrols is that if you just sit on a base, the enemy will attack you and overrun you. Your safety in a situation like that depends on the enemy not quite ever knowing exactly where you are. So they'd send out a patrol at midnight, right? And so we'd go out and we'd creep off down the valley, take up a position somewhere, watch an enemy-held village. We'd stay out there for 3 hours or 6 hours or 24 hours or 1 hour. They always varied it, and they always went to a different place. So they were constantly sending out these patrols, and the Taliban would find out, okay, wow, the patrol's over there now. It's over there today. They didn't send one out today, or did they? The Taliban never quite knew what they were doing, and that was where our safety lay. And so you never knew, like, someday you just might be sitting around and the guy smoked a lot of cigarettes and nothing happened. Other days you might leave at midnight on a 24-hour walking patrol and get back midnight the next night just completely, utterly exhausted. You never knew.
So now in these periods when they're not engaged in combat, extended periods of time, what were their attitudes like? I mean, did they have fun? Were they bored? Were they riddled with anxiety? I mean, what was that like for them?
They were all of those things. All the attacks came when you least expected it. That's almost the definition of an attack. Like, the enemy doesn't attack when you expect them to attack. It's stupid. So there was no peaceful moment, because at least somewhere in your mind you knew 2 seconds from now we could be in a massive firefight. There was an outpost called Ranch House, Chosen Company, one valley to the north. They got attacked, 20-man outpost. They got attacked by 300 Taliban fighters. The enemy just like that at 4 in the morning, boom. So the guys were fighting in their underwear. They were throwing hand grenades. They were coming out of their hooches in their underwear throwing hand grenades because the enemy was inside the base. The Taliban had taken over half the base. They were inside the American bunkers using American weapons to shoot into the other half of the base. That could happen at any moment, and you knew it. And as one of these guys said to me, some of the scariest stuff out there never happened. It was the stuff we were scared of. And your fears could drive you crazy, and you didn't even need to have an attack to experience all the fear and anxiety of what could happen 5 minutes from now. So that was the base layer psychologically. You know, above that, there was incredible amounts of boredom. I mean, 3-4 days could go by without a firefight, and the guys, maybe a week even, and the guys would just, they'd be sitting around praying for combat like farmers pray for rain in a drought, you know, because you have to understand there's nothing that young men like is out there. You know, there's no girls, there's no alcohol, there's no TV, there's no sports, there's absolutely nothing to do except fight. And so if you take everything else away, and the most intense thing you've ever experienced in your life, including, you know, whatever happened with your girlfriend back in high school, the most intense thing you've ever experienced is combat, and nothing else is happening, you're gonna wish for combat. It's a very complicated thing. And in their boredom, I mean, you know, as you all probably know, like, if you take men and you separate them from the women and children, and you put them on a construction crew, or you put them on a fishing boat, or you put them at an outpost, they get very, very vulgar, and they get very, very funny. And those guys were both things to a degree that I think can't really even quite describe.
Now talk a little bit about your guys in the 2nd Platoon in combat.
Well, there's sort of 2 different kinds of combat. There's the sort of easy, fun kind where you're attacked in a place where you have good cover, basically the outpost. So if you weren't actually getting overrun like Ranch House, if it was just a standard attack on the outpost, there was great cover everywhere, and the guys got to shoot off a lot of ammunition at these barren hillsides where they, you know, knew the Taliban were hiding and shooting from. That they liked. And it's not very complicated. You know, what's much more complicated is when you're ambushed in the open and the enemy is maneuvering on you. That kicks off a very complicated, it's almost like a football play. Like, okay, the 240 gunner lays down and the SAW gunners lay down suppressive fire while one squad maneuvers to get behind cover to get a better position. That squad starts to lay down fire, and then another squad moves, and it's a very kind of complicated choreography, and it's all being run by the lieutenant who's on the radio with the main base, telling them where he thinks they're getting hit from so they can drop mortars on those positions. Sometimes they drop white phosphorus, which would send up these incredible clouds of white smoke, which would obscure the Taliban gunners' vision. Like you can't shoot through smoke. You don't know where you're shooting, and that would allow the platoon to get to a better place. And that's terrifying, being shot at in the open where you don't have any cover. Even if it takes you 3 seconds to get to cover, those 3 seconds are absolutely horrible. And what it means is that every time you're walking around on patrol, every time you're, there were holly trees and boulders and stuff, but you'd be walking in areas where maybe from here to there, there's a boulder here and there's a tree there, and you got 10 feet to cross. Every time you walk those 10 feet, on every single patrol, you think, if we get hit right now, I'm screwed. And then you get to that tree and you're fine, and again, it's this sort of existential crisis, like, oh my God, I'm wide open. Okay, now I'm not. Now I'm wide open again. And guys see patrols, they see walking basically as, am I behind something or not behind something? It can really drive you crazy.
But they don't freak out. I mean, they're under fire. They're firing back. They're taking cover when they can. But they don't lose it. They don't become hysterical. They continue to function professionally and effectively. How is it that comes to be?
There's several reasons. I mean, they're very, very effective. They're incredibly self-possessed. I mean, there were guys who literally were watching bullets hit around them and were continuing to fire, continuing to function. There were guys who had bullet holes in their fatigues, from rounds that didn't hit them but cut the fabric. So there's different reasons. One is that their safety comes from their ability to function. If it's really simple. If someone's shooting at you, you cannot stick your head up and aim and shoot back effectively. So basically, the person who puts out the most firepower, accurate firepower, starts to control the conversation between the two sides, the conversation in bullets between the two sides. The side that puts out more firepower controls that conversation. And once you have control of the conversation, you can move and you get behind cover, and then everything starts going your way. So they know that if they stop firing, suddenly the enemy controls the conversation, all this firepower is coming in, and you can't even stick up your head to shoot back. They know that, okay? The other thing that they know, it's drilled into them, is that if, I don't do my job. I'm on the radio. My job is to communicate help the lieutenant communicate with the base. If I don't do my job, we don't get mortars, we get pinned down, someone gets killed, my best friend gets killed, I can't live with that my whole life. I'd rather be dead. So I'd rather risk dying, or I'd rather die than live out my life knowing that my best friend died because I didn't do my job. The thing they feared most was causing the death of a brother, as they called each other, brother. So here, what's the choice? You're a 19-year-old SAW gunner, and your team leader is telling you to lay down suppressive fire because your buddy is in the wide open getting hammered and he needs to get behind cover, and you're like, no, I'm just going to stay behind this tree and not shoot back because that's not conceivable. And so they don't think of it as bravery. They just think of it as, look, it's my friend, it's my brother. This is what soldiers do. And
he would do the same thing.
And that guy would do the same thing. And I mean, Brendan, the guy I got closest to out there, Brendan O'Byrne, he said to me at one point, he said, it's crazy. There are guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other. But we would all die for each other. And I thought about that sentence for a long time, and I thought about this sort of related thing. It's like, why is it that men come back from war, and in the battle company it was all men, that there were no women in that unit. There are no women in combat units, I believe. Why is it that they can come back from war, such a terrible thing, and miss it? What is it they miss? Do they really miss almost getting killed? Probably not. Do they miss killing? Probably not. What is it they miss? And I started to understand it. They miss the brotherhood. Brotherhood is not available in civilian society. Friendship is. But friendship is a function of how you feel about a person. What you do for a friend depends on how you feel about that person. If you don't like someone, you're not going to die for them. You probably won't even lend $10, right? And in combat, in this brotherhood, it has nothing to do with how you feel about the other person. It's a brotherhood. It has nothing to do with feelings. It's a shared agreement, a reciprocal agreement. I'll risk my life for you, and I know you'll risk your life for me. It has nothing to do with whether I pissed you off yesterday. Like, what you don't want in combat is to wonder if the guy you upset yesterday is actually going to cover for you in a firefight. You don't want to have to wonder that. That's how brotherhood works. It removes those sort of messy interpersonal relationships from the agreement to all protect each other with your own life. And just a sort of final note on that, I started to think, like, for a 20-year-old, like a 20-year-old guy, 19-year-old guy, you're basically at the bottom of the food chain, socially. Like, girls are all dating older guys, you can't get a job, you're like, you're really sort of, you don't have a lot going. And the things that you are valued for, you have no control over them. Like, if you're born good looking, that's great. That makes high school, pretty nice time. But you have no control over that. If your dad has a good job, if you're a wealthy family, whatever, at 19 you don't have control over those things. So the way society sees you, the way women see you, the way your peers see you, depend on things you have no control over. Now you go into combat, and you're completely self-defining. Like, in a platoon, in a situation like that, nobody cares if you're ugly or good-looking, what your dad does for a living. They don't care about anything except that whether you're a good soldier, don't fall asleep on guard duty, and be prepared to risk your life to save my life. That's it. And courage is a choice. It's not something you're born with. It's a choice. So all of these guys, no matter how neglected and disempowered or whatever in society, in combat they can be exactly the person they want to be. Not all of them rise to that, but it's at least available to them. And they're part of that brotherhood. Now, for a 19-year-old, what a secure place to be emotionally, psychologically. Imagine. And then they come back, and all of a sudden they're judged for these things that are now out of their control. They have friends, but they don't know the depth of that friendship. Is it profound or is it shallow? All these things are suddenly variable. And it makes civilian life actually, in a weird way, more threatening, psychologically threatening, than the worst combat situation.
This is a big deal. One of the fellows in your unit, Sal Junta, is going to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor next week. I mean, that's incredible. So, and you wrote in detail about the engagement, I guess, that in which he displayed such bravery, and he's going to get this medal. So, what can you tell us about that?
When I was out there, the enemy started to figure out ambushes, how to do them, and they got better and better at them. So there's an operation called Operation Rock Avalanche. They overran American positions up on this ridge. They killed Sergeant Larry Rugel, wounded 2 other guys, grabbed their gear, their weapons, their ammunition, their one of their rucksacks. I mean, they were literally on top of those guys, and they made off with them. That's hard to do to American soldiers. They did it. And a few days later, on the last day of that operation, 1st platoon, I was with 2nd platoon, 1st platoon, I didn't know those guys as well. I mean, I knew them, but not as well. 1st platoon was up on this ridge providing what's called overwatch. They have the high ground. Everyone else is going back out of their positions towards the base. When you're leaving an area, you're at your most vulnerable. So they always have someone left behind to watch everyone else. And then once everyone else is in position, those people watch the last unit to exfil. Well, 1st Platoon started to exfiltrate. They started to exfil at night on the Gadigal Spur, and they were walking down on the top of this ridge, and the enemy had set up an L-shaped ambush. Like if you want to ambush somebody, and you put a bunch of your guys on one side of the trail and the rest of your guys on the other side of the trail, you'll just kill each other. Like, don't do it that way. An L-shaped ambush is what it sounds like. You have 2 lines like that, and you're not shooting at each other, you're just shooting at the enemy. And 1st Platoon walked straight into an L-shaped ambush. They walked into 15 fighters with RPGs, light and heavy machine guns, and from distances of like 30, 40 feet. Very, very close. The entire 1st squad got hit immediately. The entire lead squad got hit within seconds. And Sergeant Josh Brennan was in the lead. He was walking point. And so what these guys did, they did exactly what I was talking about before. They laid down this massive I mean, imagine, they walked at night into an ambush, and they managed to not all get killed. They laid down this massive firepower. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. Junta started throwing hand grenades and running towards the front of the line because he knew the guys in the lead would have been in trouble because they were taking the brunt of this. He got to the 2nd guy in line, and his friend Josh Brennan is missing. And he keeps running and throwing hand grenades. He gets hit by bullets in his plate, in his vest. And he runs, and he finally sees his friend Josh being carried off by 2 enemy fighters at night on a ridge at the southern end of the Korengal Valley, dragged off alive. And he killed the guys who were carrying him, and he rushed up, and Brennan had been hit 8 times, and he sat with him and started to treat him and protect him, and they brought in a medevac. Tragically, Josh died on the medevac. But Sal Junta, within a couple of months, there was talk that he might be up for a Medal of Honor. And I talked to him about it when I was out there. He was very, very conflicted and ambivalent about that. He was really very uncomfortable with the idea of getting a medal. He's like, look, Josh is my friend. You're going to give me a medal for trying to save my friend? Like, don't call that bravery. That's friendship. Like, I mean, it almost felt kind of insulting to him. And also, he's like, everyone was brave. I was just the guy who got to Josh, but I wouldn't have gotten to Josh if everyone else hadn't been doing just as heroic things to help me out. Like, don't just give me a medal. Everyone's going to hate me, you know? Like, and he said, give the whole platoon a medal, but don't just single me out. Come on, I didn't do anything. I did what everyone else did. He was really conflicted about it. At any rate, the medal was approved, and it will be awarded to him next Tuesday in Washington. I'm going down for that to be with him. I actually, in addition to Restrepo, Tim and I directed a short film, 14-minute film on Junta, because we had a lot of footage of him and the combat and all that. So, and it's on our website. So if you want to watch it, it's pretty interesting. It's restrepothemovie.com. If you're interested in Sal, he's an amazing young man.
I think I said that Sal was from the 2nd Platoon. He's from the 1st Platoon.
Sal was from 1st Platoon, yeah. Battle Company. They're all from Battle Company,
right.
1st Platoon,
right.
2nd Platoon.
Right. The one of the biggest things that I took away from the book and the film was what I think of as the sort of the maddening ambiguities of the mission. And it's never clear what the guys, or it was never clear to me at least, what the guys were supposed to be doing there. 2nd Platoon is a very small unit. They're not responsible for taking over a lot of territory. They had very little contact with the local population, so it's not their job to win over hearts and minds. Is it really that ambiguous? And to what extent do the guys themselves know what their purpose is being there?
Okay, I'll explain it from the top down. 2nd Platoon's job, like the roles in the military are very narrow and closely defined, right? Second platoon's job was not to win hearts and minds or win the war in Afghanistan second platoon's job was to protect the main base. Like, it's very, very literal. Like, they're shooting at us from that ridge, we need to own that ridge. Second platoon, that's your job. Now, with the main base there, Captain Kearney was in charge of, quote, hearts and minds, and so the weekly meetings with the locals, with the elders of each village, happened on the main base. If the main base kept getting attacked, those meetings would not happen. There would be no relation. The whole thing sort of falls apart. So, second platoon, the men of second platoon did not have sort of like anguished sort of debates about what are we doing here. Like, they knew they were there to protect the base, and then so like, but you can take it's an infinite regression. Okay, so why was that base there? Why was the Korengal outpost, the company headquarters, in the Korengal? The Korengal didn't matter. 6 miles long. Like, it didn't matter. It didn't matter in and of itself. And right now, I'm explaining to you military logic. I'm not giving you my point of view. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just explaining to you the rationale in military terms for the decision to put men in the Korengal. That's it. The base was there because it was a very, very good place for the insurgents to use as a sort of launching point for attacks further north. It was like a perfect valley for these insurgents to use. And the Korengal didn't matter except as a base for the insurgents. And the insurgents, what they were attacking out of the Korengal was the Pesh River Valley. And the Pesh actually kind of did matter. It was a big population center. There was a lot of commerce, a lot of agriculture. It was a major transit route into Nuristan. The Americans were paving a road. With the road comes security, government access, rule of law. Like, the first thing they do is pave the roads. And then you can get all these other aspects of society into these remote areas. And then the local, this is military theory. Then the locals they have access to trade goods. They can sell their crops outside of their little local region more easily. So they have an investment in the economy, in good government. Like, the whole thing ideally snowballs. So the Pesh was just a shooting gallery while the Taliban had the Korengal. As soon as they put bases in the Korengal, attacks on the Pesh almost completely stopped. I can keep regressing if you want, right, to should we be in Afghanistan, but just sort of in a local sense, that was the logic of Restrepo, Korengal, Pesh, like that was the sort of logic of it.
So I'm going to regress
infinitely.
No, not infinitely. One piece is too scary for me. I'm going to regress one step because you mentioned Captain Kearney, and here. This is Kearney speaking to a group of elders from a nearby village. This is a quote. 5 or 10 years from now, the Korengal Valley will have a road going through it that's paved, and we can make more money, make you guys richer, make you guys more powerful. What I need, though, is I need you to join with the government, provide us with that security, or help us provide you guys with that security, and I'll flood this whole place with money and with projects and with health care and with everything. And in the film, you see that the elders actually are more concerned with some locals who have been killed by the GIs, and they seem more interested in that. But if Kearney is actually out there talking about a road over the next 5 or 10 years, what are we to make of this?
I don't know why he said 5 or 10 years. They were currently working on the road when we were there. They weren't able to finish it.
But even if they weren't talking about the road, the road wouldn't take 5 or 10 years to build. But even if you eliminate the road part, but it would be another 5 or 10 years before he is doing these, before the government, Afghan and U.S. governments, are going to be able to bring these benefits to the folks. When you hear him saying this, you don't get the impression that any of this is ever going to occur.
Well, it did occur in the Pesh. Like the Pesh River, they put a road through. there's a trade school in Asadabad. They were training young Afghans to work. It's a very poor area, and so it didn't happen in the Korengal because the Korengal was sort of tactically too problematic, and there probably weren't enough soldiers there. Like 150 men in that valley, it wasn't enough, and so Kearney was sort of giving boilerplate inducements to join with get with the program. In some areas of Afghanistan, that program actually was happening. I mean, like I was in Kabul in '96, and it was just bombed to rubble. Now there's high rises, there's cell phones. It's sort of a modern-looking city. It's completely unrecognizable. The quaint old Kabul is gone, but if you ask the Afghans who live there, like they're psyched. This is like finally they're getting back to where Kabul was in the 70s before the Soviets invaded. So I mean, you're right about the Korengal, but there are areas where everything Kearney was promising actually did happen.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap it up and go to questions in a couple of minutes, but maybe I'll wrap it up with this. The film ends with these words printed on the screen. In late 2009, the U.S. military began withdrawing from the Korengal Valley, and in fact, by 2010, that withdrawal was completed. So, does that mean that the efforts of 2nd Platoon in the valley and others who were in that valley, does that mean that those efforts were pointless?
God, I mean, in some ways yes, in some ways no. I mean, if it was important to bring development to the Pesh and to the rest of Kunar, they dismantled those bases once that process was over, and they sort of felt like they didn't need to basically like block the Taliban in that valley so that they could get those projects done. Also, I mean, it's commanders in every war, I'm sure, feel that they don't have enough men and don't have enough resources, so they're constantly making choices about, okay, is this sort of area of the battlefield just not as important as it was 5 years ago? Is this other area that we've neglected? Do we actually need to use our scarce resources over there now? There was a general sort of revamping of strategy a couple of years ago. It's called population-centric counterinsurgency, and they were realizing that these remote outposts were sort of costing more than they were benefiting the effort, and what they needed to do was put the soldiers around population centers and bring security to a greater proportion of Afghans. These remote outposts were protecting tiny villages. They're parts of the population that will really never be engaged in government anyway. So, I mean, in that sense, it was just a strategic decision by commanders, I mean, on a way lesser scale than, I mean, even if you called it a mistake, and maybe it was, I don't know. Even as a mistake, that's what happens in war. Like, people die because of mistakes. That's exactly what war is. Dunkirk, we lost 30,000 soldiers at Dunkirk. Complete massive blunder. So it's sort of what war is, and I'm not saying we should or shouldn't have been in the Korengal, but that's the soldiers, as painful as it was to pull out of the Korengal. I mean, the guys in 2nd Platoon were just incredibly upset when they pulled out. I mean, they were beside themselves, but they also kind of understood, like, that's what it is. That's why it's all so incredibly tragic.
Thank you so much. We're now going to turn it over to you guys to ask what you will. And if you haven't read the book, War, read it. If you haven't seen the film, Restrepo, make sure that you do. Sebastian, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank you for writing the book. I know a few young men who've been over there, and they don't talk about what happens in the detail that you were able to, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering what you were thinking before you went and how you justified that to your family. And you had to be a little I don't know, crazy to go over there and sign up for that? You know, that's...
When I first went, I didn't realize how much combat there would be. I kind of had the same thoughts that 2nd Platoon was having, like, wow, I bet we're just going to sit around for a year. And I'd committed to this project, so like, okay, you know, a decent writer can turn a story about a platoon sitting around for a year into a good book, so like, just do it. And then I got there and sort of it all went crazy. I wouldn't say I exactly justified what I was doing, but what I tried with my wife, what I tried to do was say, A, that I wasn't going to do anything on this scale again in combat, which I think will be true. And B, I just never told her how bad it was. She sort of found out at the end. And I also sort of explained that in situations like that, you can be stupid and foolhardy, or you can be cautious and safer. And I get scared very easily. I pay attention to when I am scared. I'm actually very cautious, and I try to think in a very calculated way about what risks are worth it and what risks aren't. And I just had the feeling that my country is like in 2 decade-long wars, and I had the feeling that there was a real social good in spending a lot of time with one unit and trying to explain to people in this country what it's like for those guys. Not politically, not strategically, all those arguments and discussions that happen, that need to happen, they're great. But I wanted people to know what it feels like to be a 20-year-old man in combat for a year, how it affects him, why he misses it when he comes home, what he's scared of. I wanted to explain those things so that when these guys come home, we have some sort of basis of understanding of what they went through so we can get them back successfully. I felt that there was a real good in that, and that's worth a certain amount of risk.
Thank you. My son is currently over in Iraq, and I appreciate your viewpoint.
Good luck to him, ma'am.
I was in Vietnam in '67, and some of my good friends were at the 173rd in Vietnam. My question is there a difference in that soldier today in Afghanistan versus Vietnam? Listening to you, it sounded identical. They were known for being very aggressive. Most of the missions were removed from central authority, so they were kind of freewheeling. And so is that soldier today different? And also the role that sometimes you hear the soldier today has to be a statesman as well, especially for a vigorous fighting unit like the 173rd. That can be very difficult. Your comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the statesman role, that would really fall to the officers, Captain Kearney, Captain Dan Kearney, the lieutenants even. The soldiers, I mean, the enlisted guys, they're really security for the sort of diplomatic efforts that are happening on the ground, conducted by Kearney and the lieutenant, the platoon leaders. You know, they didn't have privates and specialists conducting diplomacy. I mean, these guys were security, and they knew it, and that's what they were good at. I got to say that the officers that I knew were just unbelievably smart, motivated, thoughtful guys. I mean, I was just amazed by them. Huge cultural gap to cross and all that, but you couldn't ask for sort of better men in those roles. And I was very, very impressed by them. Are they the same guys, the soldiers? Yeah. I mean, combat, the essentials, the emotional reality of combat it's always been the same, you know. It's never really changed. And I think men adapt to it in the same ways. And I think if you had been up there with me, you would be having flashbacks to your experience. I mean, in the sense of, wow, that guy's just like my buddy. You know, like I think you would be remembering people in your youth from your service. You see them all around you in that platoon.
Thank you for your insights. That's important for all of us to hear.
Thank you.
I have a question about the poppies in Afghanistan and the consequences of this war. I understand that when the Russians left Afghanistan, there was about 12 to 15% of the army ended up addicted to heroin. And 10, 15 years later, they're having all kinds of medical crisis and, related to TB and HIV and hepatitis C related to this. I wanted to find out, you talked about these young men. They're 20 years old. Some of them are coming from disadvantaged situations. They're now in this war where they have a lot of control. They're going to come back. There's a lot of emotional issues related to it. Does the opium and poppy and heroin issues in Afghanistan and the prevalence of it there and the fact that it supplies 90% of the world's population with heroin concern you with these troops?
I mean, the poppy crop in Afghanistan plays a very destructive role in the war and in that society, and you could argue in the world. I think very little of it gets to the soldiers. I mean, there was nobody out at Restrepo, nobody was on anything. I think, there was, once in a while, some parents would send some vodka and a bottle of mouthwash, like that was about it. I think there was probably a little bit of pot smoking. But, I have a, Karl Marlantes, a friend of mine, a wonderful author. He wrote a novel called Matterhorn, okay? Amazing novel about Vietnam, incredible. An outpost, very similar to Restrepo, except they were in about 1,000 times more combat. And he said that one night, he was a lieutenant. He was a young lieutenant in command of a platoon at a remote outpost, and he said one night he heard a kind of thumping, like beating sound going on down the, elsewhere in the outpost. And the next day he asked the platoon sergeant, like, what was that? What was going on? And he said, oh, some of the boys caught one of them smoking pot. And so they beat him up so he wouldn't do it again. And at those outposts, it's too dangerous to not have your act together. I mean, that's the thing, is like, if you don't tie your shoelaces, you get yelled at, not by the lieutenant, but by your buddy. He's like, listen, man, if we get hit right now, you trip over those things, I'm dead. Like, tie that shit. Like, don't let me down here. And so if they could get upset about shoelaces, imagine being stoned. Like, they just don't. Everyone's life is at risk in virtually everything that everyone does. So, and even as a reporter out there, I really had the feeling like, okay, if I don't, we're going on a long patrol, 24-hour patrol, I need to hydrate. I need to drink a lot of water, because if I dehydrate, I'm twice the age of these guys. I'm in good shape, but like if I dehydrate and I start to have leg cramps and I slow the platoon down and we get hit, it's on me, So everything you did, you realized could have consequences, not just for you, that really doesn't matter as much as for everyone else. So getting stoned out there, was not going to happen. On the big bases, I can easily imagine it, but I didn't spend any time on those bases.
Thanks.
I think it's probably more pot and alcohol than heroin, though.
Thank you, that's reassuring. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your insight so far. I'm a high school history teacher in Dorchester, and I teach the 20th century in U.S. history, and so we spend a lot of time on wars in the 20th century. I'm about to start a long unit on the soldiers' experience and the civilians' experience in war, and I'm wondering what you would recommend in terms of helping students understand the realities of war, especially from the soldiers' point of view.
You mean in terms of what to read or watch? God, Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, is amazing. I thought Dispatches, it's about a journalist, really, but it's about soldiers. Dispatches by Michael Hare. It's amazing. There's an just devastating novel about World War I called Johnny Got His Gun. Devastating. I would humbly recommend my book, too. The point of my book was to explain to civilians what it feels like. That was what I was trying to do. I almost didn't worry. I toyed with the idea of not even using the word Afghanistan in my book. I didn't want anyone to think that this is about Afghanistan and the policy issues and the strategic problems. I thought about not even using that word. I wanted it to be about the universal experience of combat. That's what it was for, and so your students may find some insights in there too.
Thank you.
Hello. I just want to thank you for writing the book. I just finished reading it this week, and I have to give you a lot of credit because you got my wife to actually read a military book.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. We have a son who just recently joined the Army. He's only 21, infantryman, and will be supposedly going over to Afghanistan in the springtime. And you have a chapter in your book where you write about devotion to the squad and how that really binds those guys together. And I want to just relate this to something that happened in the news. We read about a sergeant recently, as I'm sure you probably read, who was targeting civilians in Afghanistan, had his squad with him, sort of, from what I've read, forcing them to do it. And my question to you is, with that devotion to that squad, how do we expect some 18 or 19-year-old soldier who knows that's wrong with that, if a sergeant goes off kilter like that, to report something like that, because he's probably going to be putting his own life in danger, and that devotion to squad is so strong, especially if they're on an outpost, something like Restrepo? What would happen? I mean, how is somebody supposed to make that right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, that's the you could argue that the downside of devotion and brotherhood is that it can lead you down some very bad paths, and it really depends on leaders acting well. As soon as leaders act badly, that same brotherhood and devotion turns into, I mean, look at the German army in World War II. You know, it turns into this sort of monstrous endeavor. I'm sure the German soldiers had exactly the same bond with each other that I saw at Restrepo. It was just towards this ghastly end. And so it really does depend on the leaders. Fortunately, very few squad leaders are sociopaths. That guy's a sociopath, you know. Fortunately, very few of them are, and that guy would probably be killing people in society here. It's just easier over there. And he put his men in a terrible position, terrible position, and there was sort of no way for them to win. Either they betray the trust of that unit, or they become murderers themselves. It's just ghastly. I don't know what the answer is. Probably better psychological screening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Hi there.
Good. I'm reading your book, and I think it's great.
Thank you.
I'm a student, and what I was wondering is I have to write a paper on whether we should be in Afghanistan right now or not.
Oh, that's an easy one.
And since you're a man of experience, I'd just like your opinion on that.
Oh, God. You want an A or an F?
I'd like an A.
That's such a complicated thing. Okay, I'll try and be clear and brief.
And on the record.
And on the record, yeah. I mean, here, I'm not stating my opinion. I just want to, clarify the terms, right? I'm a journalist. I don't tell people how to think. And I don't tell people they should think like me. But I am in a good position to make things clearer so that you all can make maybe better decisions, right? So I can see two very, very good reasons for pulling out of Afghanistan. One is that it's not making us safer. That would be the argument. And the other reason is that civilians are getting killed. If you say, should we be in Afghanistan, presumably you're tackling one of those two questions in your minds. So I'll divide them up and I'll try to answer them briefly. I've been going to Afghanistan since the 90s. The toll in human suffering and civilian death in the 90s was astronomical. According to Human Rights Watch, something like 400,000 Afghan civilians were killed in the 90s. Okay, that era effectively ended in 2001 when U.S. entered Afghanistan after 9/11. NATO followed soon thereafter. In the decade, not even decade, in the 9 years since NATO has been there, the highest estimates of civilian casualties that I've read are 30,000. So you go from 400,000 in one decade to 30,000 in the next one. If your reason for leaving Afghanistan is based on the welfare of the Afghans, those numbers become problematic. If I thought that civilians would stop dying at all when NATO pulled out, That's a pretty convincing argument to pull out. Unfortunately, I'm not convinced that that's the case. Tragically, I think it's going to go back to the 90s. I wish that weren't so, and we had a simple solution and we could leave. It's more complicated than that. The other issue is security. No, I don't know. No one knows if our presence in Afghanistan has prevented another 9/11. There's no way to know that. The alternative to being there, I suppose, just logically, is, okay, we leave, and if we have 9/11 every 10 years, that may be a lower cost than being over there. I don't know. That's for the nation to decide. There's no way to sort of know that, but that is the logical alternative. And the people who say that that's a lower cost, they may well be right. You know, economically, in terms of blood, they may be right. As a journalist, I'm not in a position to make that call. But I think those are the issues that we're trying to decide. I just don't know what the answers are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I interject just a quick question, just a very brief answer? What are your feelings about the multiple tours the GIs are serving? I just saw a story about a guy who was killed on his 9th tour, and there was a story a few weeks ago about a fellow on his 12th tour. It is a volunteer army. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, we're overstretched. You know, if I could, why are they doing, not all tours are 15 months, by the way. Some are 3 months, some are 6 months, some are a year. But and people are not doing 9 or 10 tours frequently, but right. It is common to do 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, I think that's happening because we went to Iraq. I mean, if you want the short version, you know, I think Afghanistan. I mean, realistically, if we had focused the amount of attention and money and resources on Afghanistan that got poured into Iraq, I think Afghanistan would be Bosnia now. In other words, it would be a sort of troubled country that is gradually gluing itself back together after 20 years of trauma. That didn't happen. We went to Iraq. I know people, I understand that you can articulate good things that came out of that war. I understand that. I don't want to get into that debate. Personally, I was against it, but I do understand that there are two sides of the debate. But just sticking to Afghanistan, that was the tragedy, is that we may or may not have lost the Iraq war, but Iraq may have cost us the Afghan war. And now guys are doing multiple tours. Everyone in the 2nd Platoon, except Brendan O'Byrne, chose to stay in the Army, despite the multiple tours. Like, they're soldiers, and they understand that's what they're going to have to do. Those guys, 2nd Platoon, they just finished their next deployment after the one I was on with them. They're just finishing it up now. I don't know what to do about it. We're stretched too thin. I think the alternative conceivably is a draft, but that has other enormous complicated downsides. The soldiers do not want a draft, not the ones I know. They're like, listen, we don't want someone pulling guard duty who doesn't want to be here. Like, forget it. Like, don't do that. And he's like, it's not going to work any better than having a draft for the police department or the fire department. Like, you don't want that. So I really don't know what the answer is.
So I was a platoon leader in Iraq, and in watching Restrepo, I think we don't see a lot of like film time with the platoon leaders, and so I just sort of assumed that they didn't play maybe as active a role. But listening to you talk today, it sounds like they went on every patrol. So sort of what made you decide when you were editing to sort of leave out, not that I'm criticizing your editing, but I feel slighted.
Yeah. We were trying to make a movie where that we gave our viewers the maximum amount of emotional access to that reality, to those soldiers. And there were soldiers who were great guys, who we were good friends with, but they just weren't comfortable in front of the camera particularly. They were a little guarded. They were a little shy often. The platoon leader was Steve Gillespie, and I think partly because of his position, I mean, he really liked it. We were good friends with Steve, but you turn the camera on him, and he just got a little bit official and a little bit careful, And so when we did our interviews in Italy after the deployment, we followed those guys to Vicenza. 3 months later, we did studio interviews with our principal characters. And those principal characters were basically the people that we thought could communicate emotionally in the most effective way with the viewers. Steve, as great a lieutenant as he was, and as great a guy as he was not that. So you drop out, once you drop out of the group we had for the Italy interviews, suddenly the footage, the verite footage, with the people that aren't in those interviews becomes less, you can do less with it, it's less interesting. And so, it's a 90-minute film based on a 15-month deployment, and you just make these terrible, terrible choices, agonizing choices, and one of them was to not have Steve in there because he was such a great guy, but it just didn't quite work.
Cool. I thank you also for your book. How far out was air assets for you guys up in that valley at Restrepo, and what was available?
Air assets were, you sound like a vet. Are you? No, you're not. Okay.
Pilot.
All right. Air assets were 30, 40 minutes away, so if we got attacked, it would take, they could get mortars going and artillery rounds coming from Camp Blessing within minutes, but air assets, the Apaches, the A-10s, took about half an hour. Basically, it was a fair fight for half an hour, and the enemy knew that, of course. They would often attack half an hour before dusk, so they'd have half an hour without Apaches, and then it would be dusk. It was at this weird half-light where it's too bright for night vision goggles and too dark to not use night vision goggles, and it really messed up the Apache pilots. And so the enemy sort of figured that out, so half an hour before dusk is often when they attacked. They're smart guys. They're fighting, we're fighting very, very smart people over there.
I haven't read your book, but I will now.
Thank you.
I'm Charlene, and I was an Army nurse during the Vietnam era. And I am now a therapist, and I work as a volunteer with soldiers from any era that they come back. And perhaps Mr. Herbert would also have some comments. I came up here with one question, and then as I listen to you, that it just gets all more of that. In looking at the Vietnam vets and comparing them as I hear you talk, there were not brotherhoods with the guys that were in Vietnam. They moved them in and out so quickly that they didn't have a time to coalesce as brothers. And so I don't think that there might have been the same kinds of feelings that you described, but I'm open to some information on that. And then I think we learned that to train soldiers as a group and to send them as a group and all of that may have come out of that. The other thing I think we may have learned is about welcoming people back. Vietnam was not a popular war. People were ignored. Soldiers coming back were not treated very well, but now we welcome them. And that has also been a very healing thing for the Vietnam vets. A couple of years ago on this day, I was down at the wall because I was living in D.C., and there has been a change. It's like a second-order change. The Vietnam veterans are now thanked. They feel better about their service. They're beginning to heal. So I want to go back to your question or your comment then about wanting to know what it was like for a 20-year-old to be in combat, because in volunteering to work with our soldiers, I'd like to know what I can do. What can I share with my colleagues about what it's going to take? Because at this point, we are looking at all of the concussions and the brain damage and the after effects of that and the PTSD. Kids who are 19 and 20 have not yet formulated their ethical sense, their morality, and we know that that's a part of what went on in Nam for them to come back.
We've got to get to the, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
we've got to get to the end of your question.
That can be my statement, and you can give me feedback on that. What can I do for the 20-year-old?
There's the physical ramifications of combat, like TBI. I know very little about that. I don't know anything about that. The psychological ramifications, they depend on what happens to the guy. Like in the Korengal, the fighting was up in the hills. It was not in villages. It certainly wasn't in cities. The American soldiers I was with never saw dead enemy fighters and never saw dead civilians once from a bomb drop that wasn't their bomb drop. It was it's like that wasn't their decision. So they didn't have these awful sort of like moral crises at these like checkpoint situations in Iraq where you think you're getting attacked with a car bomb and you stop it with machine gun fire and it's a family. Like, that's devastating. That didn't happen to the guys I was with, where I was, you know. I mean, again, as I said before, I think removing the inadvertent killing of innocents from the equation, probably the most devastating effect of combat is losing your friends. Like, just think about it this way. Imagine you got, I mean, this is mostly an older crowd. Okay, so imagine your son's in high school, and he's walking down the street with his best friend, and a car swerves and kills the friend in front of your son. Like, the guy bleeds out, bleeds to death in your son's arms by the side of the road. That's his high school experience. That happens to him senior year in high school. Okay? Imagine how long it would take your son to get over that experience of seeing his best friend killed in front of him. He wouldn't get over it. That's combat. And not only does that happen, it happens over and over, and even worse, not even worse, but in addition, that imaginary high school boy has no reason to think that tomorrow he could be dead. I mean, it's a freak accident. There's no reason to think that. With soldiers, not only are they losing their best friends, they're losing them in the ways that they're watching it happen. They're feeling guilty that they can't prevent it. I couldn't stop him from bleeding. He bled out, and I got the tourniquet wrong. Like, that kind of thing. Not only are they blaming themselves, but they're also thinking, shit, that could have been me. That's going to be me tomorrow. That's the trauma of combat. So they come back. I mean, just picture your son in high school and having that happen. That's a soldier coming home. That's what has to be dealt with. And on top of it, a lot of them miss it. So untangle that one. You know, sometimes it takes them a lifetime too, I think.
Thank you so much.
One of the things we can do as civilians is pay much more attention to what's going on in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And War, the book, helps us, and Restrepo, the film, helps us, so that we're aware of what these young troops are going through, and that when we vote or when we talk to friends or neighbors or representatives or whatever, we speak from a position of awareness and care for what's going on. That would be a big help. It really upsets me to see the degree to which people are tuned out to the wars overseas. Yeah.
The trauma that you absorb and you observe, and the information that you gathered during this period, and your own exhaustion from these 24-hour patrols, and your own feelings of fear. Can you talk about the process of writing, what you took for supplies, how you got the extra reserves to write and remember all these details to write such a book?
That's a good question. Yeah. I was, I mean, I'm a journalist. I write down everything of relevance that I see, hear, experience, or think on assignment. I would just keep filling up notebooks. So thank God I'm not just relying on my memory. I was also, so I kept my notebook, you know, I would write notes as things happened. I would also, at the end of the day, I would sit on the ammo hooch, which looked north over the Korengal towards the Pesh, very beautiful spot, and I'd sort of keep basically a very deep journal that included my thoughts, my own emotional reactions to things, my questions, the things that bothered me. Like, they killed a guy at one point, a fighter. I mean, they killed a fighter, and they sort of cheered. That cheer, I mean, I understood the need to kill the guy. He was shooting at us. The cheer troubled me. And I wrote many pages about it and eventually interviewed. I asked Steiner, like, what was that about, man? That didn't look so good. And Steiner explained it to me, you know. So that's the journalistic process. In addition, I was shooting a lot of video. Tim and I each had a video camera. Sometimes we were there alone, sometimes together. We shot video continually. And so I didn't write my book out there. I chronicled the experience out there, and I came home and wrote it very, very quickly in about 6 months, summer before last. It was a very emotional, extremely emotional process for me. For the first time in my life, it was like an extremely emotional process.
Thank you.
Thank you for your book and your film.
Thank you.
I'm a veteran with 28 years in the Navy, retired 3 years ago. I am also a gay man, and I come up here very reluctantly and nervously. I know you're not a politician, and you didn't write the book and produce the movie because you wanted to influence policy. But having lived your experience, do you think that there is a valid concern about openly gay men serving next to soldiers and Marines in combat? Is that a real issue, or needn't it be?
Right. It's a great question. Well, okay, how could I put it? Out at Restrepo, everyone kind of became the same. Because I don't mean in terms of their personalities, but in terms of their behavior. Like, the situation was so extreme and so hard, and everyone depended on each other so much that they all became a certain kind of soldier person. I think if you'd had a woman out there, she would have become that, right? You could have a Harvard-educated, whatever, he'd have become that. You could have a farm kid from Georgia, he would have become that. Like, I became that, except I didn't have a gun, right? I think if you had a gay man out there, he'd have become that. So the term openly gay, I think, would cease to be relevant out there. Those sort of like social markers that are so important in this society, those social identities that are so important in this society, Harvard grad, woman, gay man, whatever it is, they just get obliterated out there, out of necessity. Everyone is necessary out there, and I asked those guys, I put the question to them, because they were always, they were always joking around about being gay, like they were always accusing each other of being gay. It's just sort of male, whatever, humor, straight male humor, whatever, that was sort of part of the humor out there. And so I said, like, so if they said the joke was like, how long would we have to be out here until we actually started doing it with each other? Like, that was kind of the sort of the thought process, right? Because they didn't see any women for a year, and some of the guys were better looking than others, and some of those guys were like, "Okay, man, this deployment better end quick, because you're starting to look pretty good." It's all just brotherly love, really. It's humor. But I asked them at one point, like, "Listen, man, seriously, if there was a gay guy out here, what would it be an issue or not?" And the answer was really interesting. The answer was, out here, no. We all need each other. We know we got a lot weirder things going on out here than someone being gay. Like, that's just the beginning of like the spectrum of like behavior out here. Like, it's like, no, we would have no problem with it. On the big bases, they would. It's like at Restrepo, you don't really have the pleasure of your prejudices. You can't indulge your prejudices. You don't have the luxury, didn't mean to say pleasure, I meant luxury of your prejudices. On the big bases, he said it would be more of an issue, it would absolutely be an issue. And in training, yeah, absolutely. Like back in Italy or a boot camp, absolutely. It would be openly, like his opinion was openly gay in those situations would be problematic. It's ironic, though, the military's rationale for don't ask, don't tell is that in situations where the group bond is so important, you don't want it threatened by that. The irony is that it's only and precisely in those situations where it would cease to matter. And it's in the rear bases in Italy where it's not life or death, and so these other things unfortunately become problematic.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Welcome.
your response.
Thank you.
First of all, I appreciate your honesty. I know you don't want to get political. That's not the purpose tonight.
Can I have to interrupt you 1 second, because we're going to wrap it up, and there's one woman behind you, so we've got time for 2 very quick questions.
Well, I'll just leave some thought with you, food for thought. There's a page in the Globe last Sunday about Sorensen and Kennedy's speech writing, and I just mentioned that Kennedy wrote about not being omniscient and omnipotent as a country, that, paraphrasing, there's about 6% of the U.S. represent the population, and 94% the rest of the world.
Very fast.
And, okay, we can't solve everything. And you don't even have to comment. I just want people to look that quote up. And I hope your book will be the start of a talk and debate that people will pay attention to what's going on.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I just have an experience in Vietnam. I was there in 71, 72 when the troops were being pulled out and the officers were being killed by the enlisted men, the fraggings that were going on. And after I got out of Vietnam, I have to thank everybody who protested against the Vietnam War. You saved my life because I only had a 5-month tour there, 7-month tour, so thank you very much. And I was just thinking of the soldiers who die, lose the war. There's no winning or losing. It's the soldier who dies, and I cannot believe that this country is not protesting this war. We plan on pulling out the 2011. And I was lucky enough to go over to the Soviet Union. I spoke to the Soviet soldiers who fought in the Afghanistan war, and they were telling me exactly the stories you were saying. And I said to myself, when the U.S. went into Afghanistan, we'll be in and we'll be out. We'll learn from the Soviet situation. But we haven't learned from the French, from Vietnam. We haven't learned from the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I have just one more statement to say. Smedley Butler said, the war is a racket. The few profit and the many pay, and we're all paying for it, no matter how you look at it. So I would like to have this as my last one. Oh, my question is...
Very quick.
All right, very quick. My question is, how do you look at the pullout of Afghanistan, which the U.S. plans on starting next year?
I don't know anything about those plans. My worry about staying is that it's not a winnable war. My worry about leaving is that if we pull out, it'll be way worse than it is now for the Afghan people. So I don't have an answer. Those are my worries. I hope one or the other isn't true, but I can't see the future. I think there's a good and a bad way to proceed if we stay. That's a different conversation, but I don't know what decisions will be made, obviously.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
It was really good. Yeah.